So we just got done talking about ATP and what it is, and remember that's the energy currency of the body. And so this conversation is looking into detail the actual biological energy systems that are making ATP. And it's not that it's making ATP, but more so recycling ADP, adenosine diphosphate, into ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And we discussed that ATP is unstable, and so you don't store much of this in your body at all. You have about 2 seconds worth of stored in your muscle tissue, and your body can't store ATP, but it regularly stores these macronutrients, and these macronutrients act as substrate for your ATP production. Now we'll talk more in detail on this when we actually get nutrition, but for now realize that these carbohydrates, proteins, and fats are stored potential energy to be able to convert ADP back into ATP. This is coming from the foods that we eat, and we take the food we eat and we break them down into the macronutrients and in their smallest components of amino acids, glucose, and fatty acids. And from those, the body utilizes those for energy. Now just keep in mind when we look at this is that carbohydrates are only used for fuel. There is no structural or physiological or functional component for carbohydrate except for fuel and fuel only. Proteins and fats have tissue responsibilities and some storage capacities. Carbohydrates are limited in supply in the body, and fats are nothing more than unlimited or long-term storage of carbohydrates. And so when we look at when we have this conversation, proteins are very rarely used in the synthesis of ATP. If they are used, they're either converted into a sugar or into a ketone, which fats are sometimes converted to as well, and they follow the same energy pathway. So we're going to really study the energy pathway using either a sugar economy or a fat economy. So again, we have these catabolic and anabolic reactions, and we have the substrate of phosphocreatine carbohydrate fat. And again, our story is this recycling system of ADP into ATP. And this is either done in an oxygen environment, an aerobic environment, or in an aerobic state, right? So you have an aerobic system that's always working, and occasionally you have an anaerobic state. There is never a time where you aren't regularly breathing for O2. Well, there is one, and that's when you're dead. But you are always breathing and even if you hold your breath, there is some moment where your body's going to need to exhale and take another breath for oxygen. But you can be in the anaerobic state, or you can be in the aerobic state by yourself, or you can be in the anaerobic state with the aerobic state, but never in the anaerobic state by itself. And again, our roadmap here is that we understand this process that we're taking this charged battery, ATP, and we're utilizing the energy there, that unstable phosphate molecule that's cleaved off, that's yielding some energy for muscle contraction or cellular function. You're left with ADP and a spent phosphate molecule, and then your body is using, through biological synthesis, the ability to resynthesize ADP into ATP. Your body cannot store ATP. It is unstable, thus it's produced on demand. And your body needs ATP, although it's not consumed, but the energy holding that third phosphate, binding that together. The phosphate is added back to the ATP using stored substrate, either creatine phosphate, carbohydrate, fat. And then what we're going to talk about next are the biological energy systems that make this ADP-ATP cycling happen. Now, just keep in mind that this what you see right here is the energy system of the body. So we look at ATP here, and there is a lot of stuff happening, right? This is looking at all the things that are happening, from all the different types of glucose to the different types of carbohydrates, from the different types of fatty acids to the different amino acids. It's very complex biological aspects. We're not going to go into this detail. We're basically going to reduce this down into these three aspects of your aerobic and anaerobic systems, and then these three primary systems of the ATP-CPT cycle, the glycolytic, and the oxidative. So you have these three energy systems, as Phosgene, also known as immediate energy system, or ATP-CP, your glycolytic or your anaerobic energy system. Keep in mind that the Phosgene system is also anaerobic, and then the oxidative, oxygen, which is our only aerobic energy system. So the first one is the ATP-CP, also referred as the Phosgene or immediate. This is an anaerobic environment, and the only substrate used in this is creatine phosphate or phosphocreatine. And yes, this creatine is similar to the creatine supplementation of creatine monohydrate or the different types of creatine, but same thing, it's stored in the muscle. And what this does is it produces ATP extremely fast. Very low yield. So for every molecule of creatine, you're getting just one molecule of ATP. And what's happening here is that you have a phosphocreatine and you have ADP. And you see that the phosphorus on the phosphocreatine is the same phosphate on the ADP. And so what's happening is that the creatine phosphate gives up one of its phosphate molecules, and it's quickly recycling ADP into ATP. You only can do this for as much substrate as you have stored. Creatine is stored in the muscle tissue, and you have about 10 seconds of this. So this provides very short-term energy for high-intensity activities, things that are less than 10 seconds. And this is active at the start of all exercise, really regardless of intensity. But you went from ADP to ATP from that phosphocreatine donating its phosphate. Again, ATP is not stored in the muscle because it's unstable, but creatine phosphate is fairly stable and it's stored in the muscle tissue. Some ATP is the ATP is stored, but like you said, you have about 2 seconds worth. Creatine phosphate, even though you have about 5 or 6 times more stored, but still only yields you about 10 seconds worth of activity. And yes, eating meat is the best way of getting your creatine. There's a reason why I picked this image here and then this image here, is that you are basically seeing the same type. You're seeing a cross-section of the muscle, and this is a tenderloin. And if you're eating meat, particularly raw meat, so if you're eating sushi or if you happen to eat raw beef, you are getting enough creatine. Creatine is water soluble, and if you cook meat, especially if you cook it well done, you're drying it out, all that water's going along with all the creatine. So hopefully you're eating your steaks medium rare, and if you're not, you'll start and think that at least you're saturating your body with creatine. So again, here's your flow chart. This image I think is from your book. You have your phosphocreatine, you have that free energy release from that ATP and that from that ADP. The energy is using that to bind the phosphate to the ADP, making ATP, and then the ATP can be reused again, and you have about 10 seconds worth stored in the muscle tissue. Your next energy system is the glycolytic system, sometimes referred to as the lactic acid. This is also anaerobic, and this is your sugar metabolism using either glucose or glycogen. So this is basically the breakdown of carbohydrates. Doesn't matter if it's glycogen or glucose, same process. Glucose really is a transport form of sugar in the blood on the way to the tissue. So if you find carbohydrate and it's in the blood, it's going to be the form of glucose. Glycogen is the stored form of it, and glycogen is only stored in 2 places, the muscle or the liver. This is also a fairly fast system. It's your body's go-to fuel source for prolonged high-intensity activity. You have about 2 to 3 minutes worth of this stored. You never really exhaust your carbohydrate stores. It does take like 3 to 4 hours of plus like long duration activity to really deplete your carbohydrate. But your body will try to rely on fat as much as it can, but it will use sugar to some extent. But so you have about 3 hours, but the way that we'll look at the chart is that activities that you can only do for about 2 or 3 minutes, so that level of intensity before you have to take a break, that's the carbohydrate. So you usually fatigue before you run out of substrate, but if you do repetitive bouts of that activity, you'll start to run out of substrate or run out of fuel. So when we look at the glycolytic system, we look at glucose as the individual link in the chain. So that red link there is glucose, and glycogen is this multi-linked aspect. Glycose or glycose means sweet in Greek, so the glycolysis is this breakdown of carbohydrate, either glycogen or sugar. The metabolism of sugar, regardless of the form, right? We look at carbohydrates as starches and fiber and complex and simple. The final destination of all carbohydrates in the diet eventually end up as glucose, and then glucose is turned into glycogen if it's stored. So it doesn't matter if it's complex or simple. When you eat it, it will eventually become simple in the digestion. Plants take simple sugars from photosynthesis and make complex structures like starch, and then we as humans or other animals eat that starch and then break that down into simple sugar so we can convert it to ATP. Glucose is limited in its storage capacity. It can either be stored in the liver or the muscle, and this is the most important thing to remember, is that any excess sugar is converted to body fat, because body fat is unlimited in its storage capacity, and it's the long-term storage for excess carbohydrate. Right now we're talking about glucose being metabolized anaerobically, but glucose can also be metabolized aerobically as well in the oxidative system, and we'll talk about that in the next aspect. So here's your glycolytic. It's using glucose or glycogen for fuel. you have about 100 grams, or about 400 calories potential in the liver. Obviously, if you're bigger, you'll have a bigger liver, so you have more capacity. And you only have about 500 grams, so anywhere between 1,500 to 2,000 calories stored in the muscle tissue. So you have a limited capacity for both liver and muscle. This is the only storage place for the carbohydrate. And carbohydrate serves no other function in the body except for fuel. It's not used for structural repair like proteins are. It's not used for membranes or transport like fats are. It is only used for fuel. And you have 100 grams in the liver, 500 grams in the muscle, and that's it. Anything excess starts storing in the body fat. The other important thing to know is that glucose, it can be shuttled into both of these tissues, but once glucose is stored in the muscle tissue, the only way that that glucose is going to be used if it's used by that working muscle only. That's it. The liver, however, has a two-way streak. It can store glucose, and then it can release glucose. Liver is like an energy battery for the body. It stores glucose, it produces ketones, so that's its main role. But since muscles are resource hogs, they'll need that glycogen or that glucose. They'll use that when they need it. But like other tissues of the body, like the liver, the kidneys, the heart, they don't have their own sugar supply. They depend upon the liver to supply that to them. So in the glycolytic process, we're talking about sugar, but the end result or the byproduct of glycogen or glucose metabolism is pyruvate. Glucose is not fully utilized at once. There are some steps in the process, and so we talk about glucose in terms of its carbohydrate aspect and your consumption and transport in the blood, but really pyruvate or pyruvic acid is the conversation. When we look at the big metabolic chart, we'll see this, but you're probably not that familiar with pyruvate or pyruvic acid, right? This may be the first time you're hearing about it, but pyruvate eventually gets converted to lactate or lactic acid, which you're probably familiar with. This is the lactic acid or lactate is usually attributed to the burning sensation you feel in the muscle and during exercise, so more like sustained type aspect or high intensity. It is incorrectly attributed to fatigue and soreness after workout. So you'll sometimes hear that the reason why you're getting tired or fatigued is because of lactic acid, and it's actually not true. It just happens to be you're getting fatigued and lactic acid happens to be there, but it's not the cause of that. Now, not all the pyruvate is converted to lactate. Some of the pyruvate can be utilized as ATP it depends on how hard you're working and what energy system you're in. So you have this one path where the glucose is partially metabolized, it's converted to pyruvate or pyruvic acid, and it's then shuttled directly into the cell via into the mitochondria to be used for ATP. This is sometimes referred to as aerobic glycolysis, but it's a misnomer because there's no oxygen involved in this at all. This is still within the glycolytic system. The glycolytic system is always anaerobic, so to call it aerobic glycolysis is incorrect, but it's used like that terminology sometimes. The correct form of this is called slow glycolysis. What it means is that the energy demand is fast. It's high enough to be anaerobic, so outside the body's ability to oxidize with the aerobic system, but it's still a low enough intensity where all of the sugar is able to be converted to pyruvate, and it's able to be converted into back into ATP or used for fuel. If energy demand is too fast, so you went from a walk to a jog, and now from a jog to a sprint, or you were going from 5 miles per hour to 6 miles per hour, now that glucose pyruvate conversion might not be happening fast enough, and so what ends up happening is the pyruvate is then converted to lactate. And so now what happens here is that the body's still able to use this, so it's kind of a progression. You go from glucose to pyruvate, pyruvate to lactate, and your muscles are producing lactate almost at an unlimited capacity. It's only limited by the amount of sugar, and as we said, it's very rare that you'll run out of sugar. You probably fatigue before you run out of gas. The body then takes this lactate, sends it up to the liver for processing, and the liver can reconvert this back into glucose and then send it out to the body. So lactate can be processed and reutilized, but it's limited by the rate at which the liver can function and do that. So again, we'll talk about that cycle, but you have slow glycolysis, which is the direct consumption of pyruvate. You have fast glycolysis, where pyruvate is being converted to lactate, and then that lactate is being utilized for fuel. And there are circumstances where you can be producing lactate faster than which it's being cleared. So this whole lactate clearance is called the Cori cycle, and you have your glucose or glycogen, and you're in fast glycolysis, so you're producing as much energy as you can from sugar. Your body is producing pyruvate and consuming that, but you're getting excess pyruvate, so any of that excess is produced is creating lactate. That lactate is then picked up by the blood, that's sent to the liver then reconverts that back in and then sends it out to the working tissues. And you have this continuous cycle over and over and over again. Now you're losing some in the conversion aspect, so it's not like a one-to-one aspect, but you're trying to capture all the quote-unquote waste product and utilize it as much as possible. So what ends up happening is you could have a situation where you are producing, remember, you have an unlimited capacity for lactate production, but the limiting aspect is here in the liver conversion. And you can get a backflow in the blood that starts to rise both the lactate concentrations in the muscle and in the bloodstream, and that starts to have its own cascade of consequences and so forth. So again, here's the Cori cycle again. You can see the glucose either starting here or being converted or delivered here. Pyruvate, some of it's going over to the mitochondria for production, other of it's going to lactate, and you have this cycle back and forth. And in slow glycolysis, the pyruvate is going to the mitochondria for processing, right? So there's no problem there. And if it's slow enough, you're not getting any lactate production because all of it's being sent over to the mitochondria. Or if you're getting any lactate, it's definitely not accumulating because it is within the capacity of the liver to reconvert. In the fast glycolysis, depending upon how much production you're producing lactate, it's getting picked up in the blood and going over to the liver. And if your production starts to outpace your clearance, you can get an accumulation or backlog in both the muscle and in the blood. Once exercise stops, it takes a few minutes, maybe 6 seconds, but up to a few minutes for that lactate to start clearing out of the blood, and eventually the lactate's there, and eventually no lactate in the blood. When you look at lactate accumulation within the body, you start to see that there's an adaptive process to this. And so what you see here, and this is an image from your book, is the orange line here, the gold line is the untrained subjects, and this dashed purple line are the trained subjects. Lactate threshold is the point at which lactate is being produced and picked up by the produced by the muscles, present in the blood, and then this is where you start to get onset of blood lactate acid accumulation. This is where you start to get that really high level. So no lactate in the blood here, and then all of a sudden you start to see that, and then you get to the point where it's backlogged, and now it's super high, right? Whereas with trained subjects, that point happens later down in the chain. So what this is indicating is that they're able to go longer with less carbohydrate utilization, meaning that the body's probably using more fat for fuel instead of carbohydrates. So there's an adaptation there. But that's just an interesting note there. This is an image from your book kind of looking at the breakdown of the carbohydrates. So you have your muscle glycogen here, you have your glucose. This is eventually being converted down these metabolic pathways, and this is what I want to bring your attention to down here, that you have pyruvate being created, and then like I said earlier, in slow glycolysis, almost all of it's going into the mitochondria to be produced into ATP. And then in fast glycolysis, you're getting lactate production sent out to the liver and being cleared and then sent back to the muscle. So that's your glycolytic system. Using sugar for fuel, whether it's using glucose or glycogen, and your end result is pyruvate and eventually then lactate if you're in fast glycolysis. The last system we'll look at is the oxidative system. This is your aerobic system, so this is in the presence of oxygen. And this system you can either use glucose or triglycerides. So remember, we just talked about glucose in the glycolytic system, but fats or triglycerides, it can only be utilized in the oxidative system. So this is your aerobic energy system. It's extremely slow. Sugars are relatively quicker. Fats are extremely slow, but they are high yielding, like huge amount. And you have an indefinite amount of duration in this system. So again, this is an aerobic pathway. You're either using glucose or triglycerides. Your body will preferentially burn glucose over triglyceride. Not that it really prefers it, but because it needs to. Remember, sugar doesn't have a storage site. It's only stored in liver and muscle. And if you have excess blood sugar being floating around, the only place it goes to is fat. So the body's not going to burn its stored fat if it needs to store fat, because it has excess carbohydrate. So your body's always burning carbohydrates first to get to stable blood sugar levels, and then only when blood sugar levels are stable or hypoglycemic does your body actually start using fat for fuel. So glucose is the only macronutrient, the only substrate that can be used either oxidatively, aerobically, or anaerobically in the glycolytic pathway. So phosphocreatine or creatine phosphate's only used anaerobically, and fat is only used aerobically, but glucose can be used both ways, either aerobically or anaerobically. Just to show the difference in how powerful the oxidative system is that one glucose molecule, so same sugar molecule, one of them, in the glycolytic pathway will yield 2 to 3 units of ATP. So 3 times as much as creatine phosphate, but certainly in a single-digit aspect. In the oxidative pathway, when the presence of oxygen, that same glucose molecule will yield about 36 units of ATP. So you're looking at a 10 to 12-fold increase in its capacity. So the body will want to try to do things as much. It gets more bang for its buck in its oxidative pathway. Now, just to show how much a triglyceride yields, it's about 463 to be exact, of ATP. But again, glucose is used when it's a surplus in the body. It's the only mechanism it really has to lower blood sugar levels. So here's your triglyceride. It's a glycerol molecule that can be, and the glycerol looks like glycolytic. This glycerol molecule can be oxidized or can be converted to sugar if need be. And then it's three fatty acids. That's where tri or triglyceride comes from. Each triglyceride, each fatty acid can either be a short chain, long chain, or medium chain fatty acid, and depending upon how long those fatty acid chains are, you're going to get different yields of your calorie or your ATP counts. So if you have a bunch of short chain fatty acids, it's going to be lower on the scale, and if you have a lot of long chain fatty acids, it's going to be higher up on the scale. But on average, you're getting about 460 units of ATP per fatty acid. But triglycerides, these are the actual stored forms of carbohydrates. So carbohydrates converted to fat, or excess proteins converted to fat, and these are the molecules that are stored in the adipocytes or in the fat cells. The fat can only be released from the adipocytes if insulin levels are low and hormone-sensitive lipase is there. So you actually have to have an enzyme there to break these fats out, and then these get in the bloodstream. They go into the muscles, fiber themselves, or to the liver to be converted into ketones. Huge bang for your buck. Very slow process and very much dependent upon the hormonal environment. But if the hormonal environment is in the right state, you're getting the most energy yield out of fat. So again, you have glucose and you have fat, and there's this battle, if you will, in the oxidative system. Most people want fat to be burned in their energy aspect, but if they're in a carbohydrate environment or elevated blood sugar level, fat burning is at a halt, right? So if sugar levels are elevated, the insulin levels are elevated. If insulin levels are elevated, that's fat cells are one way. Think of it that way, and that if insulin levels are high, fat cells are intake only right now. So there's no way they're going to liberate that fatty acid. So we've already talked about kind of the glucose and the fat and what does what. One of the things we haven't talked about is protein, right? And as I had mentioned earlier, is that protein is not a significant source of energy for most activities. Protein can be broken down to amino acids, and those amino acids are converted into glucose or ketones to produce ATP only if there's a shortage of carbohydrate and or a shortage of fat. And this happens usually with like high intensity exercise, long duration exercise, like 3 or 4 hours plus. So like you're talking about marathon runners, and those people regularly break down protein, or in starvation aspects. So going more than a week or two without eating food, you start to break down a significant amount of protein for fuel. This is kind of the energy pathways of the body, and what you're seeing here is you're seeing your 3 macronutrients: sugar, protein, and triglycerides or fat. You're seeing the things that they're broken down into. So you have glycerol, you have fatty acids, you have glucose, and then proteins, you have amino acids. And then amino acids are then converted to either pyruvic acid and then you got the lactic acid, right, from those energy systems. But the interesting here is to see of the one-way relationships here. So pyruvic acid, once it's converted to this molecule here, it can't go back. So so sugar can be readily converted to fatty acids. Amino acids can be regularly converted to fatty acids. I'm sorry, to fatty acids or sugar if it needed to, but fat can't be converted back to sugar. So if you have excess sugar, it will become a fat and will remain a fat until burned. If you eat a protein, it can be converted, and if you eat excess sugar, it's going to be converted to fatty acids. You can also see that nothing's converted to amino acids. Protein is precious in nature, and we have more essential amino acids than we do any carbohydrate. There's no essential carbohydrate, and we have 2 essential fats, but we have essential amino acids that we need to get from our diet. So when protein is introduced to the diet, the body's going to use it and store it in any way it can well over before it's going to use it for energy. Now we have an unlimited storage capacity for protein, but we have limited growth. And so protein's stored in the muscle tissues, and it's required based on hormonal environment, basically building muscle. And if you're able to build muscle super fast, you would store protein indefinitely. But it's unfortunate we can't store protein like we store fat, because you're never going to waste fat. Your body's never going to get rid of that. So any excess amino acids are converted to sugar. And then from that, it's either converted down here to fats or up the chain into glucose and then stored either as liver glycogen, muscle glycogen, and then when those are topped off, everything ends up as a triglyceride. You do notice that we have ketone bodies here, and ketones are becoming more popular in the conversation. They really are a big part of the energy pathway. I would say that ketones are actually more important than protein, or not more important, but bigger in the total contribution to energy output. And even when you look at amino acids, when they're converted, there are glucogenic amino acids that are converted into glucose, and then you have ketogenic amino acids that are converted into ketones. And even you can see here fatty acids, these are, I had said earlier that these are slow burning, long yield, right? But fatty acids can be metabolized quickly if the environment allows it, and that environment is low glucose. So if you're in a hypoglycemic state, so low blood sugar levels, and you have low carbohydrate stores and you're in high output energy, so like high intensity exercise, your body can try to burn fatty acids quickly, but they don't burn the fatty acids. They partially metabolize them, and then they use the ketone bodies, and ketones can be used just like sugars. And so the brain, the heart, the liver, I'm sorry, not the liver, the kidneys, but particularly the muscles can use the ketone bodies. So this is ketone production. These are your 2 main ketones, and this ketone is produced from here. These are produced in the liver. The liver itself cannot use ketones, but the muscles are a big consumer of the ketones, and the heart, the brain, and the kidney also consume ketones. And there's some evidence that shows that the heart and muscles actually preferentially burn ketones over sugar. They prefer ketones than sugar. And even in the brain, there are certain areas that just function better on ketones than they do in sugar. So we'll talk more about this in our nutrition aspect, but this kind of shows you that you have the liver acts as kind of the energy battery of the body. It stores the carbohydrate. It then releases glucose if it needs it. It can convert lactic acid into glucose and back out. Fat stored in adipocytes, it's released into the bloodstream, and that can be either used directly by the tissues, or if the body needs fast energy, it can take those fatty acids, convert them to ketones, and then send them out for rapid ATP production. So that's, again, you can see how ketones are actually more involved in the energy process than proteins are, but ketones don't get a lot of the conversation. We'll talk more about that in the nutrition aspect. But this is it, a recap of your biological energy systems. You have the 3 here, the phosphagen, the glycolytic, which are your anaerobic, and you have your oxidative, which is your aerobic aspect. The substrate here is phosphocreatine. The substrate here is only phosphocreatine and only glucose, and then here the oxidative pathway, it's glucose and fatty acids. And really what determines glucose over fatty acid consumption is, do you have a surplus of blood sugar? You have this production yield, very fast, extremely, almost immediate in the phosphagen system, fast in the glycolytic, and extremely slow in the oxidative. But then you have an inverse, right? Your yield is extremely low. What you trade for speed, you give up low yield in the phosphagen. If you look at the right side here at the oxidative, very slow production, but extremely high in its yield. You have about 10 seconds stored in the phosphagen system, 3 minutes in the glycolytic, and you have an indefinite duration in the oxidative system. So to recap, you have ATP, which is highly unstable. You have ADP that's relatively stable. You have 3 biological energy systems to produce produce ATP primarily out of two substrates, mostly carbohydrate and fat. Those are the two energy currency systems. You also have creatine phosphate. And you have this variation depending on if you're in an aerobic environment or if it's being produced anaerobically. So that is the introduction. It's more than introduction. It's a thorough work through of the biological energy systems, looking at the three systems. In our next lecture, we'll talk about the relationship of speed, production, and how we actually utilize this in our understanding and how we start thinking about our nutritional recommendations and our hormonal aspects.